Alrighty, let's take a look at the next part of Unit 3. Unit 3 is kind of a bigger unit, so we'll just kind of do it in chunks. Describe how the economy self-adjusts in the long run when there's a negative output gap. So if we're in a negative output gap or a recession, if the government doesn't decide to use any fiscal or monetary policy, the way the economy will self-adjust in the long run is that resource prices and wages are going to go down. So wages go down, resource prices go down, and if those goods get cheaper, if those resources get cheaper, then our supply of goods, the short run, is going to increase, and it'll push us back to equilibrium. The opposite would happen if we're in a positive output gap. So wages and resources get more expensive. That would decrease the supply in the short run to push us back to equilibrium. So if we take a look at this right here, assuming wages and resource prices are flexible, show how the economy below will self-adjust in the long run. So fiscal policy, monetary policy, that's trying to drive up the demand for goods. All right, but if the government does nothing, and we're in this recession right here, eventually people are going to be willing to take lower wages. The prices of goods would go down. If those things get cheaper, that's going to make it easier to produce, and our supply of goods would increase until we're back at equilibrium. But vice versa, if we're in this inflationary gap, if our economy is growing too quickly and prices are getting too high, prices are getting out of control, wages will go up, resource prices will go up, and it'll make it more difficult to supply these goods, and it would push us back to equilibrium there. So that long-run self-adjustment is if we don't use fiscal or monetary policy to close up those gaps. 39, we're looking at true or false. An economy will take longer to self-adjust if wages and resource prices are flexible. All right, that's false, right? If, like I was saying earlier, if wages and resource prices are flexible, if somebody were to tell me, like, hey, there's no teaching jobs available right now, it's either lose your job or take a pay cut, I guess I would take the pay cut. I wouldn't love it, but that would allow Brunswick High to hire more teachers. The supply of teachers and the supply of all goods in the economy would increase. When an economy experiences economic growth, long-run aggregate supply will shift to the right and output would increase. That's true, right? That long-run aggregate supply represents what we're capable of, our ideal output. So if that's shifting to the right, that means that we're able to produce more in the long run than we currently are. If an economy experiences economic growth, the natural rate of unemployment will decrease. That's false. So that natural rate of unemployment, again, is frictional and cyclical unemployment, which we're always going to have regardless of how well our economy is doing. There's always going to be people trying to find better jobs. There's always going to be people that are outdated because we've got new types of, assembly lines or technology, ways of producing things. So that natural rate of unemployment is just the frictional and the structural. So even if our economy grows, we're still going to see those. All right, identify two examples of expansionary and two examples of contractionary fiscal policy. So the two big things we're looking at are taxes and government spending. If we're looking at it over here, if we're trying to expand our economy and help it grow, we want to drive up the demand for goods. We could do that by lowering down taxes. That way individuals and businesses get to keep more of their income and can spend more of it. Or they can increase government spending, like the New Deal programs. Both of those would drive up demand and help our economy grow. Contractionary policies are going to do the opposite, right? Generally, we do these if inflation are getting out of control or if we're trying to get out of debt, in which case we would raise taxes on people and decrease government spending in order to try to reduce that inflation. Explain why an increase in government spending will lead to more total spending than a decrease in taxes by the same amount. So if we're looking at our equation for GDP, consumer spending, government spending, business investments, exports minus imports, that government spending is part of it. So if government spending goes up, GDP goes up immediately. Then that money circulates. If they hire a new teacher at Brunswick High, that's government spending. They get, let's say, $50,000 a year. Then they go and spend a portion, or they save a portion of that and they spend the rest of it at the grocery store. Now the grocery store gets money and that money is going to circulate. So the reason why government spending goes up by more than taxes is because taxes are a transfer payment. And so nothing is actually produced with that. If I save $2,000 on my taxes, nothing actually got made there. But if the government pays, a road crew $2,000 to clean up a road, that is GDP. That is government spending. That does add on to our economy. All right. Use the graph below. Assume wages and resource prices are flexible. Does the economy have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? So if we're currently producing $150 billion worth of goods, but we need to be producing $200 billion, we would be in a recessionary gap. We're underproducing compared to what's sustainable in the long run. What happens to price levels and output in the long run if no policy action is taken? So if no policy action is taken, the self-adjustment, like we looked at up here, is that the supply curve would shift to the right. Resources and wages would get cheaper, increasing our supply of goods. So if our supply increases, and we're over here now, our price level has gone down. Our GDP, though, has gone back up. We've closed that output gap. All right, now let's get rid of this for a second. Assume instead that the government decides to use fiscal policy. Identify two policies that could close this gap. We've already looked at this over here, right? If we're trying to close this gap, we're going to want to use expansionary policies to drive up demand. So we would cut taxes and we would raise government spending. Now, if we're looking at the specifics here, if the MPC is 0.5, what's the least amount of government spending that could close the gap? All right, so we're trying to close this gap here. We're producing 150 billion. We need to be producing 200 billion. So the total change that needs to happen is $50 billion. So total change equals the initial change times the multiplier. Now, we're trying to solve for the initial change, but we need to figure out our multiplier first. If MPC is 0.5, then MPS is also going to be 0.5 because they always equal up to 1. This is saying that people are spending 50% and saving 50% of any additional income. So our spending multiplier, like we talked about in the last section, 1 over MPS, in this case 1 over 0.5, it's going to equal 2. So if the total change that needs to happen is $50 billion, and the multiplier is 2, the initial change that would need to happen is $25 billion. All right, we spend $25 billion, it circulates throughout the economy twice, has an impact of $50 billion, that gap would be closed. Now, it would be a little bit different for taxes, right? So remember that taxes are going to have less of an impact than government spending. Our formula for the tax multiplier, MPC over MPS. Now, if our MPC is 0.5 and our MPS is 0.5, well, then that multiplier is just going to be 1. We talked about before how the tax multiplier is always just going to be 1 less than the spending multiplier. So we could do that formula again. Total change equals initial change times the multiplier. So if the total change that needs to happen is $50 billion and our multiplier is 1, that means we're going to need to cut taxes by $50 billion in order to close that gap. Now, it's saying here, assume that the MPC changes to 0.9. Now what's going to be the least amount that could close this gap? So the total change needs to be 50 billion equals initial change times the multiplier. So since this MPC is higher, people are consuming with more money than they were before. That's going to increase our multiplier. If our MPC is 0.9, then our MPS is going to be 0.1. So the spending multiplier, 1 over MPS, or 1 over 0.1 in this case, is going to equal 10. So now our spending multiplier is 10. So divide both sides by 10, the initial change would need to be $5 billion. So these fiscal policies are going to have more of an effect when people are spending more money. When that MPC is higher, our spending multiplier is higher as well. The government doesn't need to do quite as much in order to close up that gap. They would need to spend $5 billion there. And then finally it says, assume that an economy has a positive output gap of $80 billion and the MPS is 0.2. Identify the change in government spending that could close the gap. One important thing to note here, if we're in this positive output gap over here, we're going to need to slow down our economy to get back to equilibrium. So what that means is the total change that needs to happen, we need to slow down our economy by $80 billion. So that negative there is important. We need to slow down our economy by $80 billion in order to close up that positive output gap. So total change equals initial change times the multiplier. All right, our MPS is 0.2, so our MPC is 0.8. Spending multiplier, 1 over 0.2, is going to equal 5. So the multiplier would be 5. 80 billion divided by 5, I think, is $16 billion. But again, we need our economy to slow down in this scenario by $80 billion. That means we're going to need to decrease government spending by $16 billion. If we're trying to slow things down, we need to spend less money. This would be a contractionary policy. The government spending less, and that's going to ripple throughout the economy as well. Right? If I lost my job as a teacher, that's less money I could go spend at the grocery store. That's less money for the grocery store clerk. That means that they can't pay their rent as well, which is less money for the landlord, and that also circulates throughout our economy as well. So the initial change, they would need to decrease spending by $16 billion. All right, and we'll take a look at the last little bit. So 3.9, what is the difference between discretionary fiscal policy and non-discretionary? So discretionary needs to be voted on. It's deliberate, right? Think of like and it asks for some examples over here, but think of like a stimulus check. The stimulus checks were given out under the Trump and Biden administrations, but they had to vote them in. Like the Congress and the president had to vote and agree to it. So discretionary fiscal policy is a deliberate action by the government to speed up or slow down. The non-discretionary is automatic. If we think about the welfare program, right, that is already encoded in law. It's in place and it has been a long time. If I lost my job today, I would be able to go to the unemployment office and file for unemployment. No one's got to vote on it. No one's got to pass a new bill. It's automatically in place. If my income drops beneath the poverty line, I'd be eligible for welfare. That's an automatic program. That'd be non-discretionary. So discretionary, like if it's up to your discretion, that means you have a choice of doing something. Non-discretionary, it's automatic. Identify 3 examples of automatic stabilizers. So we just talked about a couple of them. If we're looking at welfare, if people, let's say that we hit a recession and a lot of people lose their jobs. As they go beneath that poverty line, they automatically become eligible for welfare, and that helps stabilize our economy because those people will have some source of income then. If we look at our tax system, it's a stabilizer of its own. As you make more money, you're taxed more heavily. As you make less money, you're taxed less heavily. So if I lost let's say I got switched to part-time and I only made $20,000 a year, I would be moved into a lower tax bracket, meaning less money is taken out in taxes, which means I have more money, which means my demand for goods goes up. If I start making a ridiculous amount of money, my tax rate goes up, which takes money out of my pocket, which lowers back down my demand for goods. So this tax system kind of acts as its own stabilizer as well. Then we could also look at something like, unemployment benefits. That unemployment benefits serve to stabilize our economy during the pandemic. When people lost their jobs, unemployment kicked in, they were able to maintain some sort of income for 6 months, and that stabilized our economy a little bit. And the final part of 3.9 is this lag dealing with fiscal policy. So monetary policy is way more effective, and the reason for that is because fiscal policy takes forever. First off, you have this recognition lag. Congress needs to be able to recognize that there's a problem. When we faced the government shutdown in November and December, that was 2 months where we didn't get any economic data, right? If we would have lost 1 million jobs during that time, we wouldn't know it, right? So there's this recognition lag of how long it takes us to figure out that there's a problem. There is, that lag to pass the bill, or like the administrative lag. So it has to go through committees, it has to go through Congress, it has to be voted on, they have to debate it. So it takes time to pass the bill, and then it takes time to enforce the bill as well. So there's like an enforcement lag as well. So even if we passed a stimulus bill today that included stimulus checks, it might be weeks or months before we get those benefits. So for those reasons, fiscal policy generally lags behind the economy a little bit. That doesn't mean it's not important, it just takes a little bit longer to take effect. All right, now we're looking at some more general unit review stuff here. So 55, this is all true or false. An increase in consumer spending causes aggregate demand to shift to the right. So again, aggregate demand is our GDP. It's all of the different types of spending: consumer spending, government spending, business investments, and then net exports. So if consumer spending goes up, aggregate demand is going up as well. It would shift to the right. Stagflation is the result of an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. That'd be false. It would be a decrease. right? With stagflation, our supply curve is decreasing, which drives up prices and it stagnates our economy. An increase in expected inflation will decrease the short-run aggregate supply. That one would be true, right? If I think that inflation is going to skyrocket next year and I'm going to have to pay my workers more, I'm less likely to hire more workers. I'm less likely to expand my operations. That would decrease our aggregate supply. An increase in interest rates will increase investment and aggregate demand. That'd be false, right? That if I'm a business and I'm looking at investing, which that's what we're talking about with investment in economics, higher interest rates aren't going to do that. If I'm a business trying to take out a business loan, I would much rather have a 2% than a 20% interest rate. The spending multiplier is always one less than the tax multiplier. That's false. The spending multiplier is always going to be one more than the tax multiplier. Because that spending multiplier, the government spends money, it's going to immediately impact our economy. They cut taxes, that's one less time that money is circulating. Because that cut in taxes doesn't affect GDP directly. Fiscal policy includes government spending and taxation. That's true. Those are the two big tools of fiscal policy: how the government spends its money and how it charges taxes. An increase in private savings decreases the effectiveness of fiscal policy. That is true, right? If we think about that formula, 1 over MPS, well, the more we save, the less that money is going to circulate throughout the economy, right? So the more people save, the fewer times that money will circulate. If the MPS is 0.2, the tax multiplier is negative 0.4. If we're looking at our tax multiplier, MPC over MPS. So if our MPS is 0.2, our MPC is going to be 0.8. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4. Not negative 4. That's kind of a trick question there. When MPC increases, the spending multiplier decreases. Also false, right? If people are consuming with more of that money, the multiplier is going to increase, right? If my MPC is 0.8, my MPS would be 0.2, my spending multiplier would be 5. If people are only consuming with half of their income, though, then MPC would be 0.5, MPS would be 0.5, 1 divided by 0.5 would be 2. So the more people are spending, the higher that multiplier will be. Jacobs Clifford's resources are super helpful. I'm going to put sometimes. Some of them are good, some of them are not. I think this one's pretty good. All right, now let's look at these scenarios and how it would affect the economy, and then we'll finish up with the FRQ. All right, government uses expansionary fiscal policies. So we've got our aggregate supply and our aggregate demand here. I'll draw them up there. So government uses expansionary fiscal policies. Like we said, government spending is part of aggregate demand, it's part of GDP, so that's what it would change. And they're using expansionary policies, so they're designed at increasing aggregate demand. All right, no policy when there's a recession. All right, let's go back to our stabilizer here, or our self-adjustment. If we're in a recession and the government does nothing, the way that our economy would correct itself is for resources and wages to get cheaper, which would increase our supply of goods. So in that case, it would be, if we do nothing, it's going to change the aggregate supply, and it's going to increase it because things get cheaper to produce. If the government increases taxes on consumers, we're looking back at aggregate demand here, we're looking at the consumers, and it would lower down their demand for goods because they would have less money to spend. If there's a decrease in exports, exports are part of our aggregate demand as well, right? Other people are wanting to buy our goods. And in this case, if exports decrease, that means foreign countries are buying less of our goods. And then finally, a positive output gap if the government takes no policy. So here we're in this positive output gap. If the government does nothing, wages get higher, resource prices get higher, makes it more difficult to produce, and we adjust by our supply curve declining as it gets harder to make things. So aggregate supply would go down. All right, last bit of this, the FRQ for this. Assume that an economy is producing below full employment with a $30 billion gap and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. Draw a correctly labeled graph with aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and label the price and output and all that stuff. So we've got price, we've got GDP, we've got my aggregate supply, got my aggregate demand. Now it's saying that we're in we're producing below full employment. So that means that our long run aggregate supply would go to the right of what we're currently producing. So it's saying to put full employment as Y star, or asterisk, I guess, and our current employment, our current output at Y1. So what this is showing us is that we're currently producing less than what's sustainable in the long run. And for price level, label the price level PL1. All right, so I've got, it's important to remember that we ace our graphs. I've got my axes labeled, I've got my curves labeled, and I've got my equilibrium labeled. All right, so I'm good there. Assume the government implements fiscal policy. Calculate the minimum change in government spending that could close the gap. Show your work. All right, so the gap that needs to close, we're underproducing by $300 billion. So that's the total change that needs to happen. Total change equals initial change times the multiplier. So we need to grow by $30 billion. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, so our NPS is going to be 0.1 then. To figure out our spending multiplier, 1 over NPS, 1 over 0.1, is going to equal 10. So calculate the minimum change in government spending that could close this gap. So we need to grow by 30 billion. Our multiplier is 10. So the initial change in spending would need to be $30 billion. So I'll put that over here. $30 billion. Identify what would happen to the price level and output. All right, so if we use those expansionary policies and that drives up demand for goods, well then our price level is going to go up. I'll call that PL2. So prices are going to go up, and we went from here to here, we went to full employment, our output went up as well. So output went up also. Would contractionary fiscal policy cause the natural rate of unemployment to increase, decrease, or stay the same? So we had a question similar to that somewhere up here. So if we use contractionary policies to slow down our economy, that would change cyclical unemployment, but it wouldn't change this natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment, again, is frictional and structural unemployment, and we're always going to have that, whether our economy is doing well or poorly. So that natural rate of unemployment is going to stay the same. Assume instead of using fiscal policy, the government takes no policy action. Label the new price level PL2 and output level Y2. All right, so ignore this curve now. Sorry, I shouldn't have drawn on it. So if the government took no policy action, we would see that long-run self-adjustment. We're in this negative output gap. People have lost their jobs. Eventually, they're going to be willing to accept lower wages, and the price of resources would go down as well. So our supply would increase, S2, or no, it's making me put something else. So price level would be price level 2 here. Again, we're going to ignore this now. And our output would be over here now. It's telling me to put Y2 for our new output. So we'd be back on this equilibrium in the long run. All right, see you guys in Unit 4.